May I introduce you, Ian?
Absolutely.
Okay, I looked you up. You're a senior lecturer in criminology at Deakin University, the School of Human and Social Sciences. I wrote down two things that I think are distinctive about Ian. One is you won the Distinguished Teaching Award, the Chancellor's Award. And I like it when scholars also know what to do in the classroom. So that's a personal one for me to mention that you also won a teaching award. And also, you did an interesting article in the Journal of Criminal Justice Education with Emma Ryan that I am going to have to look up and read. And it's called Southern Criminologies, Indigenous Stories, and Qualitative Research. And that came out this year, I believe. Yeah. So,
certainly did.
With that, it seems like a lot of your research is on the legal aspect, on jurisdictions across national borders, et cetera. So with that, take it away with an elevator presentation.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was a very kind introduction. I'm just posting a link in the chat to the research that we did here, and as part of that gives you a link to the report and the executive summary of the report, but it's necessary to explain a little bit of the background of the nature of why the research actually occurred. The Legal Centre, which it operates primarily in Geelong, but it also has a branch in Colac, which is about 40 minutes away from Geelong towards the southwest. And Colac's probably a much more rural outpost, so to speak. It's got a population of about 8,000, I think, and it's very heavily agricultural. The legal centre is constituted in Geelong, and the way in which these legal centres work here in Australia is they're funded by a combination of federal and voluntary funding, and they run on a very shoestring budget. So the Geelong branch of the Community Legal Centre has a full-time staff of 15, and they specialise primarily in areas related to family violence, migration law, minor crime, social security law. That pretty much covers it. But in recent years, what they've discovered is an increasing body of clientele who are just basically walk-ins. They come through the door at the offices there, are older people. And those older people, and we define older people here on the basis of the literature as 60 plus, and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's 55 plus. But those older people actually present with much more complicated legal problems when they come through the door. So, and there's a snowball effect as well. So they might have a dispute with a neighbour, and then you start talking with them and they feel that they're being ripped off by their children financially. And older people generally don't like to reveal the fact that they are experiencing legal difficulties. And so generally what the Legal Centre had discovered was that when an older person came to them for assistance on one problem, the more the lawyer drilled into that problem, they found 5 other problems that were actually probably more significant and potential precursors to the broader term of elder abuse. We had to be a bit careful with the term elder abuse because we also have very strict ethics committees here, and it's a little bit like juvenile crime. As soon as you put those two words together, they're going to raise alarm bells with the ethics committees, and the same issue has emerged with elder abuse. And so we reframed everything in terms of civil law need, and part of that was under the terms of the grant itself, and the grant was funded by the Victorian Law Foundation, and that went solely to the Legal Centre. So basically all of the work that I did was as a volunteer, and I used to be on the board of the legal centre several years ago, but they called on me to provide guidance. But all of the money that was associated with the grant was a capacity building grant for the legal centre itself. And the purpose of that grant is to build their capacity and knowledge based on not only providing services for the people that come through the door, but actually building their capacity in terms of research. So they actually have a ton of data, but they've got no one to process it. And most of the people are trained lawyers rather than trained empiricists. So they came to me for guidance on how to interpret their own material as data in the context of boosting the output for their research programs. So this was a starting point. It was an experiment. And what we proposed to the legal centre is, rather than me do all the volunteer work, let's get a bunch of our criminology students in there to actually help with the data interpretation, help with identifying open source material that was related to the problems of legal need for older people. And there's a lot of open source material in Australia because it's been funded predominantly by federations of community legal centres, or in New South Wales in particular, there's a big think tank which actually serves the same purpose as the Victoria Law Foundation, and they've been doing legal needs analysis for several years, and all of their material is online, but it takes hours and hours to go through. So what we did from a university perspective was we put it open to third year students. We said, here's an internship opportunity. We had 28 applicants. We narrowed that down to 5. We did interviews with the legal centre. They were all conducted on Zoom. And we were ready to go to get the first bunch of 3 students in for their first trimester in 2019. And COVID hit. And so, thinking very quickly on our feet, and for the benefit of both the legal centre and the students, we just pulled the trigger and shifted everything online and turned it into an online internship. That changed the nature of the project. Our initial idea was to do interviews with sort of government and voluntary services that deal with older people predominantly at state level in Victoria. So we were going to do, we had these plans to do a lot of interviews with organisations such as the Office of the Public Advocate that might represent older people in legal disputes or civil disputes. We were going to interview other community legal centre people to get their perspectives about what was going on in other parts of Victoria. And we just had to can that because we were thinking on our feet, and we thought, no, we've just got to contain it to Geelong and Colac and the open source material around there. We aimed for 30 interviews. We ended up doing about 7, but some of those were combined interviews. I reckon it was one of the most fun set of interviews I'd ever conducted because I interviewed nurses. And as a criminologist, you don't interview emergency services people. You don't, you're interviewing cops or judges and whatever. So the nurses interview was probably the most illuminating thing I've ever been in because they're dealing with people in emergency. They're dealing with people that are really suffering trauma. They identify what elder abuse is probably better than the police. I always describe this to colleagues. Their critique of the current system of identifying legal problems for older people was a real indictment on neoliberalism, because what the nursing staff, they're all employed with local councils down here in Geelong and Colac, and what they were saying is, we're required by our job to do these sets of things, and the people that we see have needs that don't fit into the template that we're obliged to fit into. And so we're constantly, in order to help people, we're constantly breaching the rules that we're meant to abide by in order to provide them the help that they need. And to me, that's what neoliberalism's about. It's setting up these rules based on risk and minimisation of harm and whatever, and they don't necessarily meet the client's needs, they meet the organisational needs. And so that was a real eye-opener, because the extent of acceptance of that practice in order to provide the service, I think that was the real shocking thing associated with that. The other thing is that the students mainly relying on open source material and BCLS or Legal Centre files, basically discovered that if you take population projections seriously down here in Geelong, then about 16% of the population is going to be aged over 60 in the next 5 years. And that could double in the next 10, because we've got a very rapidly aging population. We've got a lot of retirees, we've got a lot of people that moved down here. So the demographic has changed a bit during COVID. But we've got, and you see it when you're driving around down here, there's a lot of new developments that are set up. They're actually gated communities, but they're targeting people in their 50s. So people that have had their kids, the kids have moved on. So this is retirement living. They've got a swimming pool, a cinema. It's full of Internet of Things devices to make their lives more convenient. And in the next 5 years, those 50-somethings are going to be, reaching the elder classification. And so that's going to bring a whole lot of new pressures and issues associated with potential criminological problems and issues related to abuse. So that dynamic is happening here in Geelong specifically. And Geelong is a fairly big population, and it's quite urban. But the further out you move into Victoria's west and you hit places like Colac, it's a very different dynamic, because it's a farming community, much smaller. But the people that we interviewed in Colac said, particularly in terms of legal need for older people, it's actually potentially easier to mobilise services across different agencies, because the community is much smaller. People know each other. People know where each other works. And so referral pathways, even if they're not formalised, people have that informal knowledge that is much easier, I think, to capture in a smaller place like Colac than it is in a larger place like Geelong, which has a population of about 250,000 in the broader city area. So one of the findings that came out of the report was the need for service mapping, particularly in Geelong, so that nurses know when to refer an issue to a legal person or someone at the legal service. There were issues and specific issues associated with people with dementia, which came up, and it's much harder to identify cases of abuse in situations like that, because, as most people said anecdotally, 9 times out of 10 the abuser is a family member or a carer. So the extent to which someone who's incapacitated can report their victimisation is very limited in those situations. So the more you're reliant on this co-care model, where people from local council, people from Meals on Wheels and providing voluntary services are basically needing to know what legal options there are, who to refer to, those types of things associated with their training. If there was a regret, and you can't have many regrets to complete a research project during COVID lockdowns, and we had probably some of the most significant and extensive lockdowns in the world. If there was a regret, we didn't get the opportunity to expand the scope of the study to interview more people about their perspectives. So the way we're treating it is that this was a preliminary examination into some of the issues that emerged from the people that we did interview. The shining light out of all of this is, I don't think I've ever had such great student evaluations. The students said that this project because of the work that the Legal Centre put into their development, and that was really the success of it. They said that the experience kept them sane during COVID, because it gave them the legal service was very rigid because they had to fit the students in within their existing sort of client base and whatever. So every Thursday, 9 o'clock, students had to log in. They had to show their faces on the cameras. There was no hiding. They were given tasks for the day. They had a lunchtime briefing and then an exit briefing at the end of the day. They had to produce a couple of assessments for the university that were based on their experience. But I think the way the legal service handled it was impeccable. And we've got 2 students now who have gone on from undergraduate into honours working on projects related to elder abuse. So they've taken that knowledge further. Another 2 will probably go into legal practice because they were combined law degrees. The other thing that was really interesting, the legal service, keep this quiet, the legal service didn't like the law students as much as the criminology and forensics or criminology and psychology students. And I thought that was really, really interesting. The law students tend to be much more narrower in their thinking. The forensics and the psychology students brought in the research, empirical understanding of stuff. So and the Legal Centre hadn't been exposed to that because they're all dealing with problem solving. So they actually found it refreshing to have non-law students as part of their sort of weekly supervision process. So on that note, I think it's a really good starting point to be building potentially larger projects in other regional areas. It's a good template and a good starting point to work from. And I got to say, even though it happened during a lockdown, it was in terms of the qualitative interviews, it was some of the most rich data that I've ever come across. And so over the next 6 months, we're going to try and put some of this into a criminology journal and see where we can go with it.
Very good. Thank you. Now, questions?
So these are 3rd-year students principally, yeah?
Yeah, 3rd year. Deakin has a system where you do your major in criminology, and most of our students are also doing combined degrees, so they've got to fit in with the course rules of the other degree. But we have an increasing bunch of electives at 1st, 2nd and 3rd year that are work integrated learning electives. Now, if you elect to do a work integrated learning subject, if you do it at 3rd year, you don't have to have a 1st or 2nd year prerequisite. It's kind of a shell unit. But the university is saying we've got to do more of this stuff, and I think it's particularly important in arts and education too, because there's this perception at federal government level, at least under our previous government, that arts degrees don't give you work. And so there's this confusion between employability and employment under the previous government. And so that's pressured the universities to adopt this work integrated learning process. I think in most cases that I know of across our faculty, the links with industry have occurred either through prior research links or by sheer accident. Yeah. And to give you an example of that, we had a discussion with some honours students last week, and we called on prior honours students who had gone on to work rather than gone on to further study. And one of them just so happened to bring along the Chief Registrar of the Geelong Magistrates Court. So here's me with my predatory devil's ears going up to the Chief Magistrate saying, look, if you're short, we can give you 50 interns per trimester if you wanted. And so we've got a meeting later this week to work out how the dynamics of that are going to work. And that was pure fluke. So it wasn't necessarily, for our point of view, topic-based for the legal service, it was because they've seen an increase in older people coming to them, and what they want to do, because they're on such a tight budget, they want to work on more outreach initiatives, I suppose, to increase their ability to educate older people about some of the legal issues that they might confront as they're getting older. But more to the point, I think they want to network much more with the other agencies so that there's a more efficient way of dealing with some of these problems when they do arise.
Could you, I want to ask the question, you have a grading procedure for this particular course?
Yes, and interestingly, I didn't grade any of it because the person who is in charge of the work integrated learning program is the one that grades all the papers. So his role was to say, and I think it was like 1,000 word. No, actually, the rule is that they have to submit 4,000 words of written work for university assessment. And so there were two self-reflections. One was at the start on induction, and the other was at the end on conclusion. And then there was a 2,000 word sort of summary of progress during the middle.
So the grades were sort of based on individual initiative and action and what they wrote. There wasn't a group setting per se for this.
No, although, so yes, they were all individual assessments, and they're all very much individualised in terms of their own self-perceptions. But the work was done, so we had two phases of it. So in the first trimester of operation, we had 3 interns come in, and then in the second we had 2. And the way it worked was that the legal centre would brief, in the first trimester, they would brief all 3 students at once. They were basically treating them as a group. But then they were saying, okay, well, as part of your role within the group, you've got to do this. So they were actually allocating separate tasks to bring that together as the whole. So yeah, there was they weren't working on the one thing.
Okay. The reason I ask is every time it seems like in American universities, you have a group project, there's someone who will claim the other group members ganged up on them, and therefore they received a low grade.
We get that here.
You do, okay.
Or we get the overachievers saying the others were slack and didn't do their work.
Yes.
And I wrote it all on behalf of everyone. So it works in both ways. But yeah, the legal centre monitored it very closely, because if you look at the report, the report's covering quite a lot of public open access material as well as confidential legal files. All of the students participated in the interview process. So I reckon of the 7 or 8 interviews, I did 3. The students did the rest. So, I mean, that's great experience for a 3rd year undergrad to actually, coordinate and conduct an interview. They looked at my interviews as models, but then they worked from PowerPoint slides and they participated in all of it. So that was a really gratifying outcome that they participated in that.
What are your plans for the future? Are you going to repeat this?
We've got one student placed at the same organisation now, and I've got absolutely nothing to do with her. All I did was set that up as a placement. So she's with the organisation. She'll do whatever the organisation wants her to do. I think it's a broader legal needs analysis away from the issue of elder crime. The accidental meeting that I had with the registrar of the Geelong court, that's where I want to push it a little bit further, because for a couple of reasons. I've got an interest in, I think the magistrates' courts are becoming quite unmanageable. There's huge backlogs. They were prompted a lot by COVID. There's a lot of concern over family violence issues and so forth. I think one area that needs to be developed, particularly from a rural and regional perspective, is the issue of disability. So I want to put the issue of disability forward to the people at the Magistrates Court and see if we can get a rolling series of internships, not only about court practice, but about a specific topic such as that. The other side of it is, I think if we're liaising closely enough with the court system, we can reach right down to the Western District, because Deakin has a campus in Warrnambool. Warrnambool is about 160 kilometres away. It's on the coast. It's a beautiful little town. It's got problems with methamphetamine. You know, it's all of the stock standard problems that you see in rural criminology literature are sort of embedded within Warrnambool. But Deakin has a campus there, so I'd really like to open up more opportunities down there for some of our students and see what we can do in terms of reciprocal work that helps the courts as well. One thing that the court registrar indicated is that COVID had immense benefits for them because it connected court services in ways that had not been possible before. The problem that our study indicated is that it probably didn't connect older people, because older people are less likely to rely on the technology or have access to or understanding of how to use the technology. It might have improved during COVID, but certainly all of the information that we found indicated that for older people, technology is a real barrier. But for the court system, it's a good one. So that's another thing to be thinking about and potentially monitoring in the rural context.
Danielle, I know Danielle has her hand up, and I think maybe Bridget did too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Ian, your project sounded wonderful. And I wanted to comment because my master's program was actually the second year or last year of our master's program. We actually worked with an agency. The whole program is actually set up so your second year, all the students work with different agencies that come to the Department of Criminology, and they say, we have either a real crime problem or a problem that we would like you to look into. Can you give us your students as, you know, capacity and be able to like do research and do this? And so depending on like how many agencies or organizations come and depending on how many students are in the graduating class, sometimes there's, you know, 5 different projects, sometimes there's only one other project, but it's really nice because you work for a whole year on helping that organization, and you actually have to give presentations to them, but then also you have part of the requirement is that you have to go ahead and either present it at like a local or a national conference as well. Like those are part of the requirement of like getting your degree. And so it's really nice because almost every student that graduated from the master's program where I went to school, that also like served as a way to go ahead and to get employment. So a lot of our students actually went straight into like FBI, CIA, different working with like probation and parole, either at the state level or the federal level. And so I definitely can see how like, I never thought about how it could be applied to the undergrad. I mean, obviously in like certain situations, but that's really exciting to be thinking about, especially now that I'm at an institution that kind of does a lot with undergrads in that capacity. So thank you.
The difficulty that we're always going to face, particularly at our institution, is that we run our undergrad program at 3 separate campuses, because we run one in Geelong, one in Burwood, which is in Melbourne, and then we're fully online as well. So we've got a distance education cohort. Every year, this year's been the lowest intake that we've had for several years, and we're trying to work out why that is. But the federal government increased fees for art students that impacted, I think, partly. But the other thing is that the employment market, particularly for you know, gig work, for want of a better term, it's actually quite good here at the moment. So But on a downturn, we've still got 980 new students this year. So that's at first year level. So you aggregate that across, we've probably got about 3,500 students in total that we own. You can't find internships for all of them. So we basically put it out like a job advertisement, and we asked students to put in a CV and a cover letter. So that was part of the process as well, because many of them hadn't even done that before. So we put them through the interview, and the interview process was fun because I had no idea because it was the first time, we had no idea what the legal service kind of wanted or needed, and neither did they. It was just kind of, well, we'll make it up as we go along. And it paid off. It worked really well. And I think the strategic thing that really worked well was that we didn't confine it to combined law and crim students, but we actually opened it up to other students who were from a different cohort. And the legal centre loved that. So at master's level here, we've just started a master's program. There's a push to have more work integrated learning, but we don't really have the connections with the industry to be able to make that work. So I think that's the next step that we need to take, is to actually develop those connections. And I think the advantage of being outside Melbourne is that we can leverage local stuff. That becomes very, very important.
Maybe one more question. Bridget, did you indicate you had one? No?
I didn't, but I do. I think it's such great work. It's so exciting to hear about. At QUT, we had a similar kind of project, and one of the challenges, I guess, was it was also reliant on the academic with running it to build these relationships and everything. And I wanted to ask you, because something we'll talk about in the mentoring bit, Danielle and I were having a conversation about how to bridge relationships with and work with different organisations, especially community organisations. So it just strikes me just how well you've been able to do that. But I'm wondering if you could talk about, I guess, your ideas about what to do and what works well, and then some of the challenges when you're trying to build these relationships.
It's a really good question. I think in our case, it was there were two dedicated staff at the legal centre who were basically, they took all of the students under their wings, and basically I think a lot of it was actually me being distant, actually allowing the students and the legal centre to just do what they needed to do to work out what the relationship was. I think the less that what I did, the better. My role became more of a mentoring role in terms of research technique, and that's where they called on my expertise in terms of, okay, well, what's the difference between quantitative and qualitative? How do we make an interview, work in a way that's actually going to elicit the information that you want, rather than just asking a bunch of really dry questions? So it was that type of thing. That was the day-to-day administration was very much up to the legal centre to negotiate with the student. And I think I wouldn't say that the students ever pushed back on anything, but the students put ideas forward. So there was a negotiated process, and I think coming out of it, the students are saying, well, we feel better at negotiating in these contexts because we bring our expertise, we bring whatever we've learned at the university context. So it's working out ways in which to encourage the legal centre to understand why that's valuable knowledge. And so I'm very much one step back from that, just to check in here and there. And it got to the point where they were having regular meetings and they would only invite me once every 6 meetings. So it became autonomous in that sense. And it's the same with the person that was managing the work integrated learning stuff. I don't think he attended any of the meetings at all. He worked in the background planning to set up the contractual arrangement, and then that was it. He marked the work, and so he had nothing to do with the legal centre at all. So I think the more you promote that autonomy, the better.
I would say, Ian, The neat thing is that if you go to the pedagogical literature, the scholarship of teaching and learning, you'll find a lot of research that's been done on service learning, group exercises, the free rider issue, as it's often referred to, etc. And it's a shame at my university, we have 1/2 FTE, full-time equivalent for service learning. And we could probably use 10 FTEs, and it would be a great student experience. In fact, if I was president, I'd require it. But that's not going to happen. Okay, thank you. A final word from you, Ian? Anything to wrap it up?
Not at all. Thanks for the opportunity to promote it. I think we've promoted the work through the funding body that funded the Community Legal Centre. This is the first academic audience I've presented it to, so it's really good to hear your questions and comments about it, because it was very much an experimental thing, but we're hoping to push this forward in other ways in the future. So thank you for the opportunity.
I hope you show up at the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in Baltimore to talk about this, because you'd have a ready audience, or the European Society of Criminology meetings. I think there would be a lot of people there also interested in this sort of thing. Do you have the travel money? No one does.
We don't have the travel money, but I must admit that I've been to a few North American cities before, and Baltimore's not one of them, but it's on the list. So, so as soon as you mention that, I'm keen.
Yes, there's some good tours in that city, and a place for good Greek desserts of all things.